And welcome to a 6-part series on bird feeding and eating. Don't worry, these are short segments. It would have been kind of long just to make it as one big segment, so I decided to split it up, but they aren't too long. So the first I want to talk a little bit about bird anatomy and physiology based on feeding. We will do a little section more focused on overall anatomy, but there's some interesting things that are related to feeding that I want to emphasize. Um, so, first of all, most birds fly, and because they fly, flying is a high in energy expenditure, so they put out a lot of energy, which means they have to feed regularly. So birds spend an awful lot of their time feeding, which means that they are very well adapted to what they eat. So the way that they move, their bill, their tongue, their feet, their stomach, they're all adapted to the food that they specifically eat. Um, so the so whatever that bird focuses on for its eating, they're going to be adapted to that. In addition, remember, birds don't have teeth and they don't have front hands or paws. So that means that the only way to catch or gather food and get it to their digestive system is their mouth and their feet. So they're very highly adapted in those areas for their food. But internally, birds have a couple things that are different than other animals. Birds have something called a crop. And a crop is an expandable, it's kind of a thin membrane that expands sort of like a balloon. And what this allows for is birds don't have teeth, so they can quickly just swallow a bunch of food, and their crop here expands like a balloon and fills up, and then they can go to another location to sit and let that digest. Why is this helpful for a bird? Well, birds have this great ability to fly to hard to reach locations where they are very safe. If you think of a bird, especially a bird that maybe feeds on the ground, that's a much more vulnerable place for predators to be able to get it than if it's sitting, hiding in a thick tree branch, a pine tree somewhere, or up at a very top of a high location. So they are adapted to be able to eat very quickly. Food gets stored in the crop, and then they can move to a safer location. So that's the crop. Excuse me. But birds also have something called the gizzard. And a gizzard is different. It's actually sort of two big, very thick muscles. You can kind of see it in this picture here. It's sort of like two muscles that are side by side, and the food passes through the middle of these two side-by-side muscles, and the muscles are contracting and moving and rubbing this food and crunching it up. It's basically the equivalent of teeth in a bird. And birds actually take up pebbles and rocks and they swallow it, and eventually that stuff makes its way to the gizzard, and it stays in the gizzard for a while, and that helps the friction. Think about a bunch of pebbles getting rubbed against each other with food in the mixture there, and it's going to break that stuff all down. So if you've ever been driving along the road, and especially in the wintertime, but anytime you see a flock of birds along the edge of the road on the road, they could be feeding, but a lot of times what they're doing is they're actually taking up pebbles, taking up little pieces of rock that will go into their gizzard and sort of be their teeth as these gizzard muscles rub against each other and break down their food. And they do a pretty good job. I mean, if you've seen what comes out of a bird, maybe on your windshield, it's not very lumpy, right? There's some other reasons for that as well, but in part it's because the gizzard does a pretty good job of breaking food down, even without teeth. And as we talked about earlier, when we were learning about specific things that makes a bird, birds have bills. And bills are, um, they're something that's pretty unique, although turtles and some reptiles have, things that are sort of similar. But they are a horny sheath, um, no teeth, despite the mascot for things like Ball State University, where I went to get my PhD, which shows a, a cardinal with a face full of teeth, making him look mean. There are no teeth, but this bill is a key adaptation for feeding. And because of that, bills are very adapted to whatever the bird eats. So there's all different kinds of bills. This is just a little selection of them. Some examples, we have the heron we talked about earlier, how this heron has a spear-like bill that's very sharp, and when it opens the bill a little bit, the individual up and top and bottom pieces are even sharper, and so when it stabs with its mouth a little bit open, making these very sharp, uh, you know, um, spears. And then you might wonder, how does it, without hands, get the fish into its mouth? So if you ever get a chance to just stop and watch a heron with your binoculars, do it for a while. And what it'll do is it'll take that fish and toss it up in the air and very expertly catch it with the fish head going down. And if it accidentally catches it with the tail side going down, it's going to get stuck in its gullet, as you may have heard before that phrase. And so herons are very good at flipping it up in the air and catching it head first to swallow it whole. Curlews are, you might, if you wanted to guess what it might do with this, it uses this long beak to probe into the sand and mud. So it's a shorebird, a wading bird that goes along the edge and goes down in for snails and things like that along the edge. Eagles use this beak to tear meat. Birds of prey have a curved, pointed beak. This beak is not what they use to kill things with. Their talons are really their weapons to do the killing of their prey. Talons are very powerful and grab a hold, but their beak, they think of a osprey catching a fish. It flies up somewhere, and then it'll hold with its talons. It'll hold the fish, and then it'll use the beak to tear into pieces that are that it's able to swallow. This is an interesting one. This is a shoveler, which is a kind of duck. And a lot of ducks have this. A shoveler, it's just a little bit heightened here so you can see it. But a lot of ducks, you can't tell what's going on here. There's actually kind of a bunch of ridges. And what this allows for is ducks feed in water. And if they swallowed all of the water in every bite that they took, it would be too much water. And so they need to get rid of that water. So if you watch a duck, it'll actually pull its head out of the water, and the water will come rushing out. Oh, sorry about that. Come rushing out of the side of their beak there. Okay, and if we think about feet, those are also very well adapted to eating and also what they're going to be grasping. So if you have a great blue heron, that's a fishing bird and it needs to be able to walk on muds at the sides of wetlands or things like that. Excuse me. It's got very long toes. Think of snowshoes trying to increase the surface area. And they also splay out very flat because it's going to be on the flat ground. Eagles, we talked about. Birds of prey have really powerful talons. These things, an eagle, a hawk, talons if they grabbed a hold of your hand, it could go right through your hand. Very powerful. They actually end up suffocating their prey many times with just the squeezing of their talons. Ducks, things that fish, need to be able to be fast enough to catch fish or to move themselves around in the water, and so they have webbed toes. Things that hop on the ground tend to have splayed out toes that can be flat if they're ground feeders. We talked about woodpeckers and how they have to be upright on trees, and so they have 2 toes in the front, 2 toes in the back, very different than A perching bird, or some of these other birds that have 3 toes in the front and one in the back. Notice if you're going to perch on a branch all the time, you might want it curved, naturally curved, as opposed to naturally flat foot. Also, perching birds that are on branches most of the time have a tendon that when you push right here on the claw, the toes naturally close up and lock up in place. And so, if you ever wondered why a bird doesn't fall off the branch when it falls asleep, it's because its toes are pretty much locked in place. Um, so that's the basics of some of the bird adaptations for beak and feet and digestion that I wanted to talk about with feeding.